Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism. Lovely to be back again. Been a week since we last had our wee chat. I hope you and yours are well. And we've had another heck of a week. And there's a lot going on just now, of course. And over the last few weeks, we've talked about the ferries. We've talked about Ukraine. We've talked about Afghanistan. But what we've done is we've strayed slightly from why you all turn up and why I turn up and why we all get out of bed in the morning, and that's independence. And I want to put that right this week with a show totally dedicated to our independence and how we get there. There can be no doubt that back in 2014, for most of you who were watching this, it was the greatest time politically of our lives. We had a completely united movement. We had a leader in Alex Salmond who had been focused from 2007, laser focused, right through to 2011 when he got the majority. Between 2007 and 2011, he knew that the unionists were never going to agree to any kind of referendum or backing it. So by 2011, when we got our majority, we were laser focused, and the Yes movement took off, and we were united. There was nothing that divided us, absolutely nothing. And that's all we did. Now, I think it's time we get back to being solely focused, because in between times, with a change of management, we have gone off in different tangents. We have been changing England's vote about Brexit. We've had GRA, we've had Me Too, we've had all the nonsense with the Alex Salmond trials and judicial reviews. And I think we, as a movement, need to get back to basics. And I want to discuss that today. And to do that very thing, I am joined by three wonderful people, all members of the SSRG, I should hasten to add. And that is Professor Alf Baird, Sara Salyers, and new to the show, first time here, a newbie, Geoff Bush. Lady and gentlemen, welcome to Through a Scottish Prism. Lovely to have you here.
Hi, Roddy. Hi, everyone.
Good, and I hope this all finds you well. You heard my intro there about the background and why I want to have us today discussing our core belief, that belief of independence and how we can get there, because I see it more and more on social media and when I interact with people, and I'm not sure about yourself, but people saying, yeah, but how are we going to do it? And there's the different ways. So tonight I'd like to discuss them. And the first one I'd like to discuss is because the reigning Scottish government are saying that we're going to get a referendum in 2023. Let's discuss that. Sara, if I could start with you. What do you see as the advantages of a referendum as a road to independence, or disadvantage of a referendum to independence?
Well, if we had a truly fair, honest, reliable referendum, one in which the franchise did not include people who were just passing through. I don't mean I would exclude any section of Scottish society, but there are people who are only temporarily in the country and they have no long-term stake. So, that doesn't make any sense. We saw every one of the rules regarding a referendum broken the last time. We saw the media reporting, or at least 70-30 in favour of the no vote. We saw the bow within the Purda period, which introduced a completely new concept, this Devo Max, right at the last minute. And we know perfectly well, that there's no way that the rules are going to be observed. They weren't the last time, so we have no guarantee that they would be again. But if they were, if we had a completely fair and properly regulated and reliable referendum, the advantage is that it does give us a clear mandate from the Scottish people. If we get a yes vote, it's a very clear mandate, and that's very difficult to disagree with. The downside, I think I've probably covered. I don't think there's any way that at this moment, the way that things are, that we can guarantee a truly representative referendum, and that we can guarantee things like it. That the last referendum was registered in law as a consultative referendum. That means that there's no contract, and therefore when the rules were broken there was no fraud and there couldn't be any judicial review. So, we're up against tricksters, I suppose is what I'm saying. So that's my take.
Alf, you and I have discussed before, and Sarah's touched on it on the franchise, that and you have recommended yourself in your book, if you want to do a wee plug, feel free, Alf, we'll let you do as many plugs as you like in Don Hodden, is the franchise should be possibly using the UN method of which they set out, for example, the New Caledonia referendum. I assume, have not changed your position on what that franchise should be.
Yeah, well, what we're talking about here is self-determination independence. And the UN is quite clear on this, that there should be no external interference in that at all. And that includes external media, other governments, other funding, and so on. So the referendum we had in 2014 was full of external interference and the propaganda blitz that we had. And basically Better Together was external interference, if you like, because these are all UK parties that were participating in and opposing the self-determination of the Scots. So the entire referendum in 2014 was subject to external interference. But fundamentally, the franchise, which, because Holyrood was given a local government franchise, that's the franchise they're using. So they're using a local government franchise for not only national elections, but also national referendums, which is completely irregular. And it allows us, as Sarah says, a lot of people passing through, or holiday homes, students, basically anybody that has an address in Scotland can vote against Scottish sovereignty and vote to give away Scottish sovereignty. And this is a real problem. So it's a very irregular franchise. And as you say, the UN sanctioned approach in New Caledonia had secondary criteria. And that secondary criteria was designed to basically take out of the vote, I think, as many as 20% of the resident voters, if you like, that didn't qualify under that criteria. And that included length of a period of time within the country, as well as where if you had parents born in New Caledonia, where your main economic interests were in New Caledonia or not. So we have to remember that a lot of people wouldn't qualify in that sense if we had the same secondary criteria in Scotland. So essentially, that would the entire referendum that we had in 2014 was subject to immense external interference, not just the franchise, but the whole process itself.
If you were looking at some of the excuses, Geoff, or not the reasons that the referendum in 2014 was lost, you come up with things like the currency and the famous George. You're talking about external interference. George Osborne arrived in Edinburgh, and you can't have the pound, and Gordon Brown and the vow and all this. And so the things that we lost, you'll be out the EU, etc., etc. I mean, I'm ignoring things like aliens landing, which we heard about, or having our airports bombed. I mean, just the serious stuff. Although I would imagine some of the Tories that were saying that at the time were serious. But those matters have not been addressed since 2014, have they? So if we were to hold a referendum, that would still be a problem for us, would it not?
So, some would say that the exodus of UK politicians from Westminster to Scotland was in fact like aliens landing, but no one really took too much notice of that. I mean, I actually think it's. I disagree with Alf about the franchise. I'm not all that worried about that. But I think I know you asked Roddy for us to think about some of the advantages of a referendum. Mm-hmm. I'm by no means advocating a referendum as the way to independence, but I think it's really important to at least include both Section 30 referendum and a non-Section 30 referendum amongst what are generally held to be potential routes to independence, because I think if we don't include those within the list of potential routes, then you tend to alienate people who only can see the referendum route as the way to independence. If you're presented with a list of 6 options, none of which is kind of recognizable or familiar to you, then you're less likely to kind of get engaged with them. But I would say, in terms of the pros for a referendum approach, there is a precedence, and that is actually what people are familiar with from 2014. So you have to give that a little bit of weight. I think the cons far outweigh the pros, though. The stone cold certainty that there will be, even if interference from the, if you like, colonial power is absolutely forbidden. We know it will happen. It's just the nature of the kind of integration of our country into the mass media of the UK. We're surrounded by it, and I mean, there have been some really interesting parallels. So, for example, the Brexit referendum, the parallel there would be if the BBC was switched off and all of the broadcasters from the European Union were allowed to broadcast into the UK in order to try and persuade people to stay in the EU. And that's essentially what happened in 2014. I think there's a much broader disadvantage to, particularly to a Section 30 permitted referendum, and that is that it unfortunately, the 2014 referendum did set, for me, it set a precedent that was a way to go. And if we were to proceed down that route again, then you've got almost an inviolable precedent, and I think that's really dangerous for the because it essentially assumes that the people of Scotland recognise that Westminster is sovereign. The Scottish government recognises Westminster is sovereign, and they'll use that. Any attempt to go down any other route to independence that recognises the sovereignty of the Scottish people will be thwarted by that sort of double precedent. So I think it's a dangerous road to go down.
I agree. The other thing is, if anyone disagrees with me, please interrupt me, but I don't see any English Prime Minister now or in the future ever agreeing to Section 30 anyway. I just don't see that happening. So the only other referendum can be one without a Section 30. The only way they would agree is if they think for sure that they're going to lose it. And I don't think they're willing to take that risk. But then that leaves us, if we're not going to use a referendum, so there has to be other ways. So other one that's mentioned, Sarah, quite a lot, and I've got to say, I should declare an interest, as they say, it's the one that I feel most comfortable with, which is, of course, a plebiscite election, which from 1934 until 1999 was the SNP policy, which was if you got a majority of MPs at the Westminster Parliament, they cannot deny that mandate. We might come back on that, as what Geoff was touching on there, because as we know, our friends in England like to move the goalposts, change the rules, and make them up as they go along. But what do you think about a plebiscite election where we were to win 30 or 31 seats in Scotland, and that was then a mandate to negotiate our secession from the Union? Again, pluses and minuses.
Okay. Actually, if we had been talking about this, I don't know, in 2014, I would have thought it was absolutely the way to go. But things have changed. So, and they've been changed, I'm afraid, by the current executive of the SNP, and particularly by Nicola Sturgeon. So up until, right up until 2014 and a little bit beyond, we had this position which Thatcher and Tebbit and Major had all reinforced, really, really powerfully. If Scotland wants independence, all the Scots need to do is vote for a majority of pro-independence MPs. Ha ha ha, as if it ever would.
Mm-hmm.
And of course we did. And but that was set, that if a vote for the SNP was a vote for independence, you vote in a majority of SNP MPs, and they can on behalf of Scotland withdraw from the Treaty of Union. So plebiscite vote was a really exciting possibility back then. However, we have heard, I don't know how many times, but at least once from Nicola Sturgeon, that being in power to represent everybody in Scotland, whether they're in favour of independence or not, is the main job of the SNP. And I don't see why they shouldn't do that and be clearly a vote for us is independence. But she has said a vote for the SNP is not necessarily a vote for independence. Boom! There goes your plebiscite election. So I think it's going to be very difficult to come back from that. So what basically, I think if we were where we were prior to that statement that a vote for the SNP is not necessarily a vote for independence, and prior to a time when the SNP clearly wasn't willing to work with other independence parties, no matter whether that cost, brought in unionists or not into the Parliament, prior to a situation now where it's no longer clear, I would have been 100% in favour of it. I'd have said I think it's the way to go. But I think it's going to be tough now. You'd need to really clear up clear the lines, make it absolutely crystal. You're voting this party, you're voting in the. And truthfully, I don't believe there's a snowball's chance in hell that Nicola Sturgeon's never going to do that. Sorry.
I hear you saying that. I'll set that aside. Let's take the personalities out, but let's just say Alex Salmond or an Alex Salmond type person retakes the SNP. I'm talking about the actual way of doing it.
It's not about. I'm not saying about personality. I'm saying we have this now. Where a vote for the SNP is not necessarily a vote for independence. Stated. So nothing to do with who she is or her personality. I'm looking at what has been said and what the track record is.
I heard you say it. What I'm saying is if a new leader takes over from Nicola Sturgeon and says, I want to, this next election, because I accept in 2015, she said a vote for the SNP is not a vote for independence, so we couldn't very well, if we'd known what the result was going to be, we could have, and I've seen some people since saying, we should have done it in 2015. Well, we didn't have, because I believe, personally, that however we do it, we need a mandate from the people, whether that be at a plebiscite, at a referendum, or anything else we go into. So, Alf, setting aside the personality of Nicola Sturgeon, as an instrument to get independence, could we revert back to the plebiscite method?
Well, I think we have to try every means that we can to get independence. I'll take any independence any way it comes, Roddy. Because remember, it's absolutely vital that we have independence. It's also extremely urgent now because several majorities of nationalist MPs have been squandered, basically, since 2015. So the nationalist government, once it started to achieve majorities at Westminster in Scotland and also at Holyrood, are basically, that's de facto independence in any territory. They have the power then to assert sovereignty, and we know that the Scottish people are sovereign. So they've not been doing that. And my view. I'm a student of post-colonial theory, and it tells us this: the template is there. Where you have a dominant national party, it reaches a cooperation with the administrative or colonial power. That accommodation means it delays independence. It leads the people up blind alleys. It feathers its nests. It builds up its pensions. It promotes all its friends to important positions. It then attacks the real independence movement and the radicals. So this template's all there. And also in that template is the creation of new independence parties more serious on delivering the sovereignty to the people. So the other thing here, the reason why it's so urgent is not just that the SNP have squandered all these majorities they've been given. It's because the nation in colonialism is perishable. And what that means is that as time goes by, the nation itself will no longer really exist in any serious sense. And that's also due to partly demographics, but it's also cultural change, ongoing cultural change here. And you know my views about Scots language and other aspects, which are what give people their identity and what gives us our national consciousness. And the base of the independence movements, the movement is the indigenous native, if you like. It's not the people from other countries that come here seeking a better life for themselves and quite often entering into the better positions in their employment and so on as well. So the nature of what we're facing here is quite clear. The other aspect here is I don't think the British state would be keen on independence, however it's determined, whether it's a ratified Section 30 referendum, whether it's a plebiscite, whether it's a UN decolonisation. The UK state, the British state, will oppose everything, and they will completely change the hurdles, as we've seen with the majority of SNP MPs. The majority of nationalist MPs was always the mechanism to end the Treaty of Union alliance. But that's subsequently, that narrative has changed with this view that a referendum is required. And we know as a matter of law that a referendum is not a requirement for independence. So we shouldn't faff around with this. We're dealing with an entity that's always going to be dealing in bad faith. Even when majorities come for independence, whether it's through referendum, plebiscite, decolonisation, this organisation we're dealing with is always going to be dealing with us in bad faith, irrespective of how we deliver a majority.
Yeah, perfidious Albion. And we know that. Geoff, we touched on earlier when we were talking about referendums, about the legality, and people say out there, oh, but it's not legal, we've got to be legal. And I'm asking a question here, I'm not stating, because you guys are the experts, but to me, no one could deny the legality, surely, of a plebiscite election, not even the Westminster, who say they're sovereign. If the sovereign people of Scotland used Westminster sovereignty against it and gave us a majority, surely they couldn't call that illegal.
I think it would be generally accepted internationally as a perfectly legitimate means to gain independence. I think doubly so if the independence parties actually make the statement in their manifestos that if there's a majority of seats, then that is a mandate for independence. I don't think there'd be any issue about the legality of that at all. It's visibly democratic. There's the history of the kind of theoretical acceptability on the part of the UK government of a majority of pro-independence MPs in Westminster is kind of well documented. But maybe the rules have changed now. But the only concern I guess I would have would be a unionist boycott. But I think you'd be too worried about that. I don't think you'd be too worried about that. It would just make the number of seats more, make it more of a stark result. I don't think any.
Why would you boycott it? Because their big thing is getting in the big boys' seat at Westminster, and every seat they can get in Scotland, whichever party it is, helps them do that. So why would they boycott it?
Unionist voters would potentially boycott it because they don't want independence. Simple as that. They would potentially establish a boycott and say therefore we boycotted it, therefore the result's not valid.
I would say tough luck.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that, but I'm just kind of looking at the cons of it. I think also I would certainly take a plebiscitary election as a viable route to independence, and I think we need to be kind of opportunistic about this, and that it could well be that the next Westminster election might not happen in 2024, might happen in 2023. And if that is the case, in either case, it's the first, if you like, democratic event that's likely to provide us with an opportunity of going for a plebiscitary election, going for independence. And as Alf in particular has pointed out, time is of the essence now, because we are seeing Scotland being dismantled before our eyes, and we can't allow that to happen. And I think I would tend to be as opportunistic as possible. And if a plebiscitary election is the first a general election, is the first potential event, then we should go for it. We should go for it big time. Now, you asked to take personalities out of it.
Yeah, that's the problem.
I think it'd be rather good if certain personalities were taken out of it, but I don't see the current SNP leadership going for that at all. No, I don't think they really want independence. I think we all know that.
Yeah, but Sarah, there is a precedent in history for us to look at. Again, I'm now after telling you not to have personalities. You can bring the personality back in, because back in 1918, the Irish Independence Party, who had got very settled down in Westminster, who were, enjoying life in London, had they weren't settling up for Ireland. The people of Ireland get fed up, and of course put in Sinn Féin. 2 months later, we had the declaration in the Dáil, which brings me closer to where we're going to go, I think, with this wee chat of ours. But that could be an option on the plebiscitary side, that another party, albeit Alapart, ISP, whatever, could ignite the Scottish people, and we could make it, the Scottish people, could make it a plebiscitary. Could we not?
We could. I mean, just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it can't be done. And so many times, movements get stuck, campaigns get stuck until somebody says, "Why don't we do this?" And well, nobody's ever done that. But looking back, it seems obvious. So I'm convinced that there's probably more than 6 routes to independence. But I think that I have a suspicion that probably the route that will work and the route I hope that we're going to wind up taking is one that combines both a mandate from the people, and use of popular sovereignty and input from elected representatives. I don't think I don't think it can come from one or the other alone now. But so it means we can be creative. We can, my preferred route. We use our constitution.
Yep.
And then Kenny McCaskill is talking about a convention of elected representatives. That is actually a legally valid route under the Vienna Convention. If a majority of elected representatives, on behalf of those who elected them, got together and declared independence, that would be likely to be accepted, and it would satisfy international law. And he's also talking about, much to my delight, introducing into such a convention, trade union leaders,
Civic Scotland as well.
Yeah. Civic Scotland as well, which of course is kind of referring back to Scotland's old Convention of the Estates, the Assembly of the Communities of People. And these are validly elected representative people. I'd like to see an element, of representatives from the public, like a jury. But here's your problem: who's going to convene that? Who's going to call it? Because if it's an ALBA initiative, the SNP will boycott it. Is Labour going to do that? So that's where I see the possibility of the sort of popular campaign and the demand. We can mobilise the public to demand this, and in the process to organise and begin to put into place those citizens' assemblies that were once part of Scotland. Then you could see a movement with heart, head, and feet on it.
Again, we've always got to, and this particular, what I'm trying to do here is forgetting the personalities. I'm just looking at the route, Alf. Can you think of any other route, barring the plebiscitary or referendum, that would be viable and achievable?
Well, I think the plebiscite election one is probably the best option at the moment. Although, as Sarah says, and Kenny McCaskill has implied, there's nothing to stop these nationalist majorities getting together now and forming a convention, because we've talked about the urgency. There's a whole range of reasons why this is very urgent. I also think that, we could have a general election next year, but we could actually have one this year the way the Tories are going. Because it looks as if they're imploding every week. It looks that they'll have a change of leader quite soon, and that might not go down that well. But there seems to be constant bad news with the Tory party, as is normally the case.
It's great, isn't it?
Yeah, so we could have an opportunity very soon. I think the issue for the voters in Scotland is they have to understand really what independence means and why it's important. And it's not about things like currency and about these kind of things. In my view, it's about the state of the people, and the fact that colonialism is theft of resources, and it's about oppression of a people. And we have all the features of colonialism. Although we're sitting with a treaty of union, pretty much every colony had a treaty. It was given a treaty with various promises of this and that, but fairly meaningless at the end of the day. It's just a piece of paper. It doesn't guarantee the relationship will be respected. And that's what we have. So we're a plundered economy. We're politically controlled outside the country by organizations outside the country. But we also have cultural and linguistic oppression and socio-linguistic aspects, which goes right to the root of inequality, lack of attainment, health issues, all sorts of things. And the way this country is, basically, we are an undeveloped country. We are not as developed as we could be, obviously, without access to resources. All the resources are plundered out, and we have to back in things like energy at high prices, which is ridiculous. So
you must be looking at the island with all these ferry routes as a ferryman. Seeing tiny island with 48 European links now.
Yeah, this is it.
None, not one.
I had my friends that started a new ferry service last week from Netherlands to Norway under the Motorways of the Sea policy I helped develop with the European Commission over many years. Many routes have been started this way. And I've been arguing this for the Scottish government to do this, but Scottish government work to London's diktat on policy, on transport policy, on international relationships. It's always international relations is reserved. The Scottish government don't do anything internationally. They could be speaking to EFTA. They could be speaking to the UN. They could be developing international transport corridors quite easily. They should be. They have the mandate to do that. They have the majorities of MPs and MSPs, but the official administration, the civil service, holds them back. So we end up being an underdeveloped people, an underdeveloped nation, an exploited nation. People have to understand that. And the UN tell us that independence, self-determination independence, is decolonization. We need to understand our wretchedness in that sense.
I'll frighten all these things, Geoff. And we are underdeveloped, but the thing is, it goes back to your first answer. The people have been programmed and told for so long, they will want answers and things, not on constitutional matters. They'll be wanting to hear about currency and pensions, and that will be used as a big stick. However, we try to get away from the Westminster Parliament. How do we get around that?
Who are you inviting into this nest of whatever it is, Roddy?
But it's these things that we have to answer.
I think it's
actually, Roddy, could I come in for 1 second there?
Sure.
If give Geoff a minute to think what he wants to come in on this. I think as you know, I'm working with others on the fact that Scotland has a constitution of its own.
Yes.
Right up until the Treaty of Union, England had a constitution and Scotland had a constitution. And somehow, despite the fact that ours was protected, we now have the English constitution in Scotland. And it's extraordinary. People, we don't understand largely. We don't learn in school what is a constitution. What does it do? That collection of principles that decide how government will take place in a nation. That we had. Most people will tell you Scotland never had a constitution. Of course we do, but it's been superseded. And the fact is that we have a constitution that gives the people of Scotland the right to limit government, the right to veto something that government does. For instance, these energy prices, or the right to redress if the government acts against the common good. We actually have a very beautiful constitution, largely expressed, articulated in the Claim of Right, but actually contained in all these different documents and statutes and conventions and traditions that typify the way that the Scottish government was conducted, which is nothing like most of us once believed. Believe it or not, that is a country's constitution is very closely protected under international law. You can demonstrate you have one and it's ratified and it's accepted, as ours was. There's massive international backing and legal support for that constitution. Now that wouldn't demanding that back, which is what we're working on, and trying to get that back in place, wouldn't immediately mean right. We've got our constitution back. We're independent, but it would create the position where the people can put that mandate out. They have that right. They don't have to beg and plead and wait for their elected representatives to say, yeah, we'll do it every 5 years. Yeah, okay, we'll do it next time. So it's there, and the point about this one is it does precisely address those things because it puts people back in the conversation. It puts those things on the table that are distressing and let's be honest, killing people. Government policy is killing people. It's leaving our kids hungry, our people homeless, our elderly and our young cold, our disabled barely able to make it. This is democide, and this is what concerns people. And I think when you say to people, you have the power to stop this if you're willing to use it.
But
and it's also
the question. Let me then, Geoff, I don't want you to think you're in a nest being attacked here. Carrying on from Sarah's wonderful point there, how do we get the people of Scotland, because they understand, as you elucidated very well at the beginning, they understand referendums, they understand general elections, but how do we get them to understand that there's a constitution? If you allow me to be a devil's advocate for a minute, I've heard it said by others, oh well, it's an old document and it doesn't mean anything and it's not legal, it doesn't count. How do we get the people of Scotland to buy into this, Geoff?
Well, I think that's part of the task, if you like, that the SSRG and others have kind of set ourselves for the next 2 or 3 months. But just thinking about the document, the Claim of Right, for example, is yes, it's an old document, but it's asserted, it's renewed at least every year by the monarch, no less, and it's been asserted as valid in the House of Commons. I can't remember the latest.
2018,
statement.
I believe. 2018.
Yeah. Okay. So it's an old document, but it's a live document. It can be shown to be a live document. But just turning to the question about how to make the people more aware, not only of let's think about the awareness has been quite low
Mm-hmm.
amongst any about any route to independence other than the referendum route, and I think that's kind of fair to say. Part of the task that SSRG has set itself with a series of roadshows leading up to a conference in late July and a people's convention thereafter, is to kind of mop up some of the kind of whittabootery that what about the currency, what about borders, what about all the rest of it, although but there's a recognition that as well as talking about routes to independence, which is what we were focusing on today, that you can't just say, well, you need to have you need to generate and in fact get people to generate their vision of the way that an independent Scotland would be, the way that people want to see it to be. So along such lines as individual rights, land reform, borders, currency, pensions, these issues need to be properly addressed and put into the context of, well, here are part of the reasons why. Here are the positive reasons why, if you like, which address the objections that Better Together created back in 2014. Doesn't mean there won't be other sets of objectives, and objections, should I say. And I don't think we should limit ourselves necessarily to looking at those factors where we came unstuck in 2014. We should think about tomorrow's battles as well as yesterday's battles. Mm-hmm. But I think we kind of need to mobilize people about mobilize people's knowledge about the fact that they are already sovereign and therefore have access to a number of different ways of becoming independent, quite aside from distinctly aside from the referendums, and actually demonstrate why the referendum route is probably not such a good idea, even though it's a path that's been travelled before. It has tremendous disadvantages, and I think the other 4 or 5 routes that we've been looking at are much more complete, proper, legitimate, internationally acceptable than the referendum route, and less susceptible to interference by the British state and its mainstream media. So I think that what is about to happen is an attempt, at least on behalf of both SSRG and other interested bodies to it's an educational process. Mm-hmm. But it needs to be a widespread and widely adopted educational process. We really need to mobilize people over this next few months.
Yep, it's Alf. It's almost like going back to, not that we want to have the same outcome of Bonnie Prince Charlie, but it's like raising the colours and calling people to them. That we have to give them something to come towards, and I don't know if the political parties are right. I think SSRG and or outside groups are the ones to do that, so that people can coalesce round whatever of these 6 routes that are the best way forward.
One of the points I've been making is that independence is not about political parties necessarily. The Yes campaign, the Yes movement was not about a political party. No. So independence probably is better being delivered by an organisation that's doesn't look like a typical British political party, isn't structured like a typical British party, and doesn't behave like a British political party. Probably we do need an organisation like the Yes campaign before that is party neutral. It doesn't have to be a political party. The other thing about referendum is, remember that Brexit succeeded, if you like, without any plan, without any forecast really about what was going to happen. We had a lot of expectation there was going to be a disaster in many ways, and that's what's happened. Certainly in logistics, supply chains that I was involved in, shipping and all the rest of it, just been an absolute disaster. And we kind of knew that was going to happen from the maritime perspective. But the fact was, Brexit succeeded without any plan. Now, this is where I think the independence movement makes a mistake. It tries to suggest that the future is going to be this and that, on currency, on pensions, on this, that, and everything. And these are just targets for the No campaign to rubbish again. You know, Osborne saying currency, or whoever. They just come and attack everything. The press, the media will attack everything you say. So you're better actually saying nothing and just tell the people the reality. The reality is this is your predicament, and you're going to be stuck with it. And Scotland will perish and disappear eventually. And we don't have any control over our borders. Our demographics are totally changing all the time. And we know that. And the census has been delayed for a year. The census will be very interesting because we know that the no vote is buoyed tremendously by people that don't have any or don't see themselves as holding to a Scottish identity. The Edinburgh University research told us that. And so the people that don't hold to a Scottish identity have a highest propensity to vote against independence. Yeah. You then focus on the Scottish element of the vote, if you like, the people that do hold to a British and Scottish identity. And then because of colonialism, we have what's called the colonial mentality, the colonial mindset. Now, that's a psychological condition we're dealing with. You can tell these people they'll be the richest people in the world and have all the oil in the North Sea, and they'll just still say, we can't do it. And that's what they did before. And that's what they did for generations. Ever since Margot said it's Scotland's oil, people were still saying, nah, we can't do it. It's the colonial mindset. So we have these two constraints. We have uncontrolled demographics with people coming in that don't hold to a Scottish identity and have no interest. They have no foot in the game, as it were. They have no interest in Scottish citizenship, Scottish nationhood, Scottish sovereignty. Rather the opposite. And then on the other hand, we have half the population or half of Scots pretty much retain this colonial mindset, which as I've found in my research is related very closely. We call it the Scottish cultural cringe, but the psychological condition is actually appropriated racial oppression, which people develop because of the culture that's imposed on them. And the culture that's imposed on them is portrayed in the colonial sense as a superior culture, a superior language. And that's why people appropriate racial oppression of themselves, and they accept their oppression as deserved, which is not. And they accept all other aspects, wars, clearances, lack of opportunity, poverty, they accept that as deserved. And that's the colonial mindset. So it's a psychological condition we're dealing with. And telling people they're going to have a currency or pension doesn't change that. So you're dealing on the one hand with half the no vote didn't have a Scottish identity, and the other half didn't want one.
Well, then, Alf, that sounds like a bit of a doctrine of despair, because if you accept though that sounds like a fairly intractable sort of situation, and other than doing something about the franchise, how do you get around it?
By returning people's certain knowledge of the actual sovereignty they possess. When people understand that they have this power and they can use it, and that they have always had it, and they begin using it, all that psychological brainwashing that's gone on, all that cloud of despair just disappears. And I cannot tell you the number of people I have had come back to me since I've started talking about this and saying, this is how Scotland operates. Not how it operated, but how actually Scotland operates legally. Not in fact now, but this is what we are. This is how our constitution works. This is what a constitution is. This is how it works. This is what's guaranteed. This is who we are. I've had people come back to me and tell me they've had the first sense of real hope and excitement since before the 2014 referendum. People are absolutely galvanized by this. And so it's not desperate, but it does mean that the constitutional route where we restore people's awareness and knowledge of what our constitution is and the powers that it gives the people over their government. Think about that for a minute. The power of the people over their government. It's so radical. And despite being so old, it's so modern, it's so desperately needed right now that it has the power to shift that long depression that has sat on the Scottish psyche, that sense of hopelessness, that Scottish cringe. Because suddenly we're not this little, wait a minute, we have a more robust, we have a more extraordinary, we have a more radical notion of democracy and the power of the people over their government and what that means and how that takes effect, than anybody had any idea, and certainly than has ever existed in England and in most other European nations as well, I might say. So I think that is why the claim of right route and the constitution, because it's not just the claim of right, the constitutional route is actually the answer to the mental colonisation of Scotland.
Well, I believe that to be true. But here's the thing, Sarah, Alf alluded to these elections. The Brexit election was won with a bus saying 350 million quid into your NHS. Nicola Sturgeon went round last year with a bus, both votes SNP, it won. Nigel Farage went round in a bus for Brexit. The last general election, Boris went about saying, let's get it done. We need to get it into language in short bites that we can get to the people that they understand it. The claim, I don't know, the claim of right is your right or whatever. We have to come up with ways of getting that. How do we do that? That's the $64,000 question.
Well, if there is any pro-independence and pro-democracy, anti-corrupt advertising genius watching this, can I invite you to step up and
for nothing, no fee.
Absolutely, no fee, it will emerge. But we have lots of brilliant people in Scotland. Let's put our heads together. Let's start doing this, and it's going to start with the road shows and talks like this, and it is building momentum, and it will build more, and we will have to come up with those catchy slogans that, in our case, will happen to be the truth.
Yeah, here, Geoff, I want to, since how you were felt a wee bit ambushed last time, I want to give you the floor here. Utopian world, Geoff, you're now the gaffer. You're in charge. You are Presidento Busho. Well, no, it's not got a good ring to it. You know what I mean. So what would you do tomorrow? You're in charge of Scotland and its independence. What would you like to do tomorrow?
I first of all, I would find that genius, but they must have a bus, that's a real that really puts you on the puts us on the spot, Roddy. I mean, if I was a benevolent dictator, do you mean?
Absolutely.
I would immediately.
Or the head of the Yes movement. The head of the Yes movement with absolute authority.
I thought you were giving me some real power here. No, but in order to actually mobilize the whole thing, if I had a few wishes, well, I would just say, right, let's just start. Let's just do this. Let's haul the MPs back from Westminster, establish a Scottish convention, just declare ourselves independent right away. There's nothing stopping us doing that right now.
Except personalities.
Well, it's whoever, just do it. Just start. If we don't do that, then we're missing big opportunities, and do it on the legitimate bases that lie throughout the 3 or 4, if you like, non-referendum routes to independence. We already have a majority of independents supporting MPs in Scottish seats in Westminster. We can do it right now. We can just do the manifesto for India route without having so much as a manifesto to do it, and declare ourselves sovereign and go through a transition period and have a confirmatory referendum at the end of a couple of years. That's what I would do.
Right, well, I'm going to be all powerful, Sarah. I've just sacked President Bush, and I'm now making you President Salyers.
Thank you.
Yeah. So what would you like to see and do? Knowing that you're going to be sacked very shortly, and President Baird will be taking over.
Before you get him in, I'm going to set up borough assemblies or citizens' assemblies around Scotland. I'm going to have them electing representatives to the Assembly of the Communities, otherwise known as the Convention of the Estates. I'm going to have that second chamber now able to veto, to restrain, limit, and seek redress from the representatives of the Scottish people who have been lent their power by the Scots. I'm going to take that wonderful thing, the Common Good Fund, that never existed in England, started with Robert the Bruce, was statutorily enforced by the boroughs in the 16th century, and we'll start using that to put a percentage of all taxes, any revenue that comes from the oil, the gas, the wind energy, offshore energy, the whiskey, the exports of Scotland, anything that comes from the land which belongs to the people goes back to the common good. That fund is still there. It's only a few million now, but it's there. And I would basically take that mechanism for a Scottish constitution that puts the people in charge, and draws on the brilliance and the expertise that we have in our population and have it in place so that Professor Alf Baird, when he becomes president, can't get rid of it.
Well, if you had said, I was loving what you said. If you had said, and I will remove duty from gin, I wouldn't have appointed the new president, but you didn't. So I'm afraid you're sacked. President Baird, what are you going to do? What would you do?
What, me, Roddy?
Yeah, what would you do?
I think what Geoff said was very good.
You would reinstate Geoff, okay.
But I think fundamentally the people have to know what independence means. And we're not telling the people why they need independence. And it gets back to the colonialism thesis that I would say is very important. The reason why the current elected members don't do as Geoff suggested is because we know in post-colonial theory that the dominant national party is both petrified and bought. So we've not moved ahead since 1707. It was exactly the same in 1707. So when they were petrified and bought. So that's the reality. It's a despicable reality because a whole nation is held back because of it. A whole people are left impoverished and actually enslaved. A lot of people are enslaved. Let's remember that the only people that really support this union within a colony, if you like, is the bourgeois, the middle classes, and the proletariat. That's the groups that are the most pampered by the colonial regime. So we know the groups that will support and defend the union. And in colonial literature, these groups are, in some respects, called the watchdogs of colonialism. So this is all, we can see this. We can see how it pans out. So whatever happens, if Geoff's theory comes to play, then I think the first thing that needs to be done is the convention of MPs and MSPs or whoever else is involved in that needs to appoint people to lead the institutions of a new Scottish state very, very quickly. And these people have to swear allegiance to that new Scottish state, because that is fundamentally important. Remember as well that colonies have become independent before, but it's still the same people running institutions and still intercepting all the economic rents and still siphoning out all the assets to the colonial power. So we have to be very careful. And as the Estonians suggested when they changed leadership, and we found that from Leslie Riddick's fine film, that they had to change the leaders of the institutions of state. That's everything pretty much that has to be done. So that's what has to be done fairly rapidly, and to ensure that the leaders of the institutions of the state that implement policies and reforms and change and democratic mandates, they have to have allegiance to the Scottish state and not to the former colonial power. And that's fundamental. So if we're moving rapidly towards independence, that is what has to be done. Before we get to promises on how great things are going to be in terms of pensions, policy, currencies and everything, it's basically the mechanisms of state have to be organized. So a national party that's voted in majorities should already have people in place to head up ministries, to head up institutions, and this should all be prearranged in readiness for independence.
We've run out of time, folks, and I just sort of wrap it up. Firstly, by thanking you. This has been fantastic. And I saw recently someone on Twitter or Facebook, whatever, social media, saying, you know, I don't understand why we're putting up with this. Why are we not doing something about it? And someone put, and it really quite sums up what I was saying with simplicity about COVID and weather. And that's probably why we're not on the streets. But you know, there is a kind of apathy to it. But you're right, we have to move. Because when I was growing up in the 70s, I know I don't look it, but there you go, in the 1970s, the people who were poor and impoverished were the people who were unemployed. Now, people who have got 2 and 3 jobs are impoverished and living in poverty and going hungry. And kids are going back to the 1930s, getting God knows rickets and God knows what else. So it is more urgent than ever. And to you people out there listening, to these 3 geniuses, ex-presidents of the Scottish Republic, these people are the people you've got to get behind and listen to, not to the media or that box in the corner. And when they call a meeting, the first one, you know, you see, go along, give your support. You can make the difference. We sitting here talking in a room can't. It's up to the people, the sovereign people of Scotland, to take their claim of right and use it. That's the message I think my guests and I want to get across to you today. And once again, thanking the 3 of you, and to you all out there watching, please take care till I see you again.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.